Tonight, impeachment moves to the Judiciary Committee with experts on impeachment and the Constitution. The question is, did the president commit an impeachable act? And if so, what should articles of impeachment look like? Is their focus too narrow, or is this whole thing going too fast? We're going to hear from the experts, the members of Congress, and our own legal panel as well. Then we move beyond impeachment as the Trump administration looks to resume the death penalty once again. In Texas, of all places, the state, they block an execution in a well-known case. We'll debate the use of the ultimate penalty. And later, the state of police relations with communities of color. On the same day, this young man honored for forgiving the cop who killed his brother. The nation's top cop warns that if police don't get more support, they might find themselves without police protection. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I am Richard French. It has been another day for the history books, as for just the fourth time in American history, the House of Representatives moves closer to impeaching a president of the United States. Today, the process, it shifted from the Intelligence Committee to Judiciary. Their task? To determine whether the president committed impeachable acts, and if they believe he did, to draft and vote on articles of impeachment. Now, they heard from 4 experts on the Constitution and impeachment, 3 saying they've heard enough and they support impeaching the president with the facts already on the table. The 4th, though, said the process was moving too fast with too much uncertainty in the facts. For a quick look at today's critical hearing, we turn to ABC's Serena Marshall.
2 arguments hitting at the heart of the impeachment debate.
If Congress fails to impeach here, then the impeachment process has lost all meaning. If you're going to accuse a president of bribery, you need to make it stick, because you're trying to remove a duly elected president of the United States.
What is a high crime and misdemeanor? That's what 4 constitutional scholars were asked to answer as the impeachment probe enters a new phase in the House Judiciary Committee. The 3 law professors invited by Democrats agreeing.
President Trump has abused his office by corruptly soliciting President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine to announce investigations of his political rivals.
Soliciting itself is the impeachable offense.
And a single legal scholar for Republicans echoing GOP sentiment that the process followed by Democrats was flawed.
His call was anything but perfect. This is not how you impeach an American president. That has not been explained to me. Why you want to set the record for the fastest impeachment. Fast is not good for impeachment.
But actually, if Mr. Trump does get impeached, the process in the House will have taken longer than it did for President Clinton in 1998. President Trump weighing in from overseas.
It is the most unfair thing that anybody's ever seen.
But the White House rejected Democratic offers to participate in the hearing. One of the reasons Democrats argue waiting for the courts to weigh in or the 2020 election isn't an option.
We cannot wait for the election to address the present crisis. The integrity of that election is one of the very things at stake.
There's going to be a vote on impeachment in the House Judiciary Committee as soon as next week. We expect Democrats to begin drafting articles of impeachment in the coming days. The House of Representatives setting itself up for a full vote before Christmas. Serena Marshall, ABC News, the Capitol.
Serena, thank you. Now, for those of you who missed today's hearings, we will once again be playing extended highlights right here at 7 p.m. right after RFL. But there were some moments that we wanted to focus on first, including a question and answer series between the counsel for the committee Democrats and the 3 experts that they called to testify.
Professor Carlin, do scholars of impeachment generally agree that abuse of power is an impeachable offense?
Yes, they do.
Professor Gerhardt, do you agree that abuse of power is impeachable?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to focus the panel on the evidence they considered and the findings in the Intelligence Committee report that the president solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Professor Feldman, did President Trump commit the impeachable high crime and misdemeanor of abuse of power based on that evidence and those findings?
Based on that evidence and those findings, the president did commit an impeachable abuse of office.
Professor Carlin, same question.
Same answer.
And Professor Gerhardt, did President Trump commit the impeachable high crime and misdemeanor of abuse of power?
We three are unanimous, yes.
Professor Feldman, will you please explain why you concluded that the president committed the high crime of abuse of power and why it matters?
The abuse of power occurs when the president uses his office for personal advantage or gain. That matters fundamentally to the American people because if we cannot impeach a president who abuses his office for personal advantage, we no longer live in a democracy. We live in a monarchy or we live under a dictatorship. That's why the framers created the possibility of impeachment.
And we also wanted to share one of the key moments from the lone expert call today from the Republican side, George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley. In this clip, Turley criticizes the speed with which the impeachment process is moving.
Impeachments have to be based on proof, not presumptions. That's the problem when you move towards impeachment on this abbreviated schedule that has not been explained to me. Why you want to set the record for the fastest impeachment. Fast is not good for impeachment. Narrow, fast impeachments have failed.
So here are the questions. Did the Democrats make the case today that they needed to make here that the threshold of a high crime and a misdemeanor was in fact attained? Did Republicans do enough to continue to sow seeds of doubt? For answers, let's turn to Susan Bloch. She's a professor at Georgetown Law School. And Professor, thanks for the time. I thought it was interesting today because I know a lot of people went in saying, well, it's going to be pretty dry. We're going to get into a lot of academia. I know you don't look at it that way, but I thought the testimony and the thresholds from a historical perspective on what the Founding Fathers both intended and the applications of were really interesting from those four professors. To that end, did you agree with the three principal ones that said, yes, not only was it there, but in the case of Mr. Gerhardt, he said, not even close. This is the worst abuse of power that we've ever seen from a sitting president. Do you think they're right?
I do think they're right. I think this was a classic example of misusing the powers of the executive office and a classic impeachable offense.
So you saw what the Intelligence Committee basically drew up, and it seemed pretty clear that not only did they say that both national security was in peril, democracy was jeopardized, and more, but they seem to be clearing a runway for multiple charges that they'd lay out here. And bribery certainly wouldn't be alone, obstruction of justice, and maybe even more. I know some of this is tactics, but you know, the question often asked is, Pelosi wants to see this thing wrapped up as soon as possible. Conversely, a lot of people say there's both evidence and witnesses we haven't yet heard from. Can they have their cake and eat it too? If they have an expedited timeline, aren't they basically saying we got to limit the scope of this probe here and we're not going to hear from people that may be additive to the case?
Yeah, I think in part what they're referring to and what they're debating about is whether to include some of the obstruction of justice that was alleged in the Mueller report. Some of the acts that President Trump took to arguably obstruct justice. And if they added those charges to the impeachable charges, I don't think that would delay anything because we do have the Mueller report. So to the extent it would delay, I think it would be fairly minimal. I agree if they added a whole new series of charges, that would add delay.
I know Washington is known as a small city in many ways, and certainly in your world, I'm sure you've run across Jonathan Turley, brilliant legal mind. But from his perspective, he had dual concerns. One is he said that there's only been paper-thin evidence to this point. Moreover, the president really hasn't been afforded channels to challenge some of the claims, meaning going through the courts. And more than that, he worried about a precedent that would be set here, that if you moved on this and we consider this to be impeachable, then basically this becomes a political mechanism to get a president out from an opposing party if they have the votes in both chambers. Obviously, we bring our own baggage, but for me, how much more evidence do we need to know that something improper not only happened, but we could get more answers if there wasn't so much obstruction in terms of both documents and witnesses being prevented from being turned over. You heard Turley's argument. I have problems understanding why the benefit of the doubt always is going to the president, seemingly, in this particular case.
Well, as you indicated, I do know Jonathan, and I like him, and I thought his testimony was excellent today. But I disagree with him. I think we do have I think the Congress has a very strong case to make. I don't think there's need for more investigation. And I think the Democrats are appropriately trying to do this so as not to interfere with the next election. So it's difficult. There's no question about it. And obviously, President Trump would provide the evidence that's requested. It would take less time. It's fairly common for someone on the other side of an impeachment to complain about procedures, but this is a really serious accusation against the president. There is a fair amount of evidence, and I guess I don't think that they should delay much longer. But the main point that Jonathan made, and I agree with this, is that we have to be careful in that we are setting precedents. And we do not want impeachment to be the remedy for an election that we don't like. We don't want to abuse impeachment. But I don't think the Democrats are abusing impeachment right now.
Finally, the professors were being asked in many ways to try and divine what the founding fathers intended as it relates to this particular set of charges that the president is facing. And for some, they said, you don't have to divine much. They clearly articulated concerns about foreign involvement in our elections and perverting our democratic elected process of electing a president potentially. Do you think it's pretty clear? I mean, given that they talked explicitly, obviously they didn't know about Ukraine by any means, but certainly they were concerned about France or England getting involved in our elections. You know, they've been asked, I'll ask the same of you, you know, what would Madison have thought? What would Hamilton have thought if laid out the charges with seemingly a lot of evidence to, you know, confirm that the sequence of events happened as described? What would they think about what President Trump attempted to do, certainly, with President Zelensky?
I agree with those who testified who said that interference by foreign countries in our election, or in general in our country's affairs, was a primary concern to them. At that point, obviously, we were a weak country. But now, as a strong country, there still is the danger of foreign meddling. And that was a principal concern then and should be a principal concern now. Fascinating.
And I can just imagine some of these conversations in the law school library, or even in the classroom. They're getting a real firsthand experience, especially in con law. But Professor Bloch, I certainly appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, when we come back, we'll bring our legal panel in to weigh in on what we heard today and where we are right now with this impeachment proceeding, the case the Democrats are building and the ones Republicans are trying to tear down. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be right back.